Good day, good morning, good evening. My name is Lalita Raman, and I'm based in Hong Kong, where it's just about midnight. So, just a bit about me. I'm in the people development space, wherein I enhance the ability of people as well as organizations to transitions. And I do this through coaching, one-on-one groups, as well as facilitating workshops. I have a panel of 5 people today, and today's topic is part 2 of the art of change leadership, leading and inspiring change at the intersection of people, culture, and strategy. So let us invite the panelists, and once they come in, they will introduce themselves one by one. So a big welcome to each of our panelists, as well as a big welcome to each of you in the audience. So let's have, in the alphabetical order, Alex, please introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alex Prasis. I am currently a professor at the Chicago School teaching in the IO Psychology program. And I'm also on the side doing consulting, advising, facilitating around culture and change.
Thank you, Alex. April, over to you.
Hello, everyone. My name is April Moore. I'm a Director of Organizational Effectiveness and Learning and Development for VNS Health, which is a non-for-profit home healthcare organization in New York City.
Thank you. Chris, over to you.
Hello, everybody, and happy Monday. I'm Chris Kruger. I'm the Global Lead of Change Management at Unisys.
Thank you. Nikki.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. Nikki De Silva. I'm the Chief People Officer for Golf Canada, which is the National Sport Federation for Golf in Canada. Have about 20 years of experience previously in higher ed and in international development.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Trent, over to you.
Hello, Trent Cotton. I'm the Vice President of Hatchworks Vice President of Talent and Culture for Hatchworks. It's going to be one of those sessions. Based here in Atlanta, but we've got employees all throughout the U.S. and Latin America. Author of the book Sprint Recruiting, and just finished. I got to get the editing done, but just finished over the weekend a new book, High Performance Recruiting. So I do consulting on the side as well as leading the HR function for Hatchworks Technologies.
Brilliant. Thank you to each and every one of you. So this is our part 2 of the same topic. And the reason we are having a part 2 is because each of us here felt we barely scratched the surface on part 1. And we decided we'll have a part 2, given our interests as well as the audience interest, that the interest that was seen from each of you in the audience. So let's, the first question, this is about art of change leadership, leading and inspiring change at the intersection of people, culture, and technology. So how do you lead others through change? Is there a methodology or a metaphor? Or what's the most common way of doing it? Who would like to start first?
I'll go ahead and jump in, try to get myself sort of like moving a little bit. Really excited to be here to say that once again. So, I think that from the point of view of when I am supporting an overall change initiative, I do use ProSci's three-phase initiatives and their tools and their resources. But when it comes to sort of like the level of helping and supporting people through change from the people side, I utilize models like William Bridges' models, the change curve, and also ProSci's ADKAR model as well, to get down to sort of like the individual impacts or how people are psychologically dealing with transition to help me think through ways in which I can support them getting through to the other side.
Yeah, I like a model that's called Kubler-Ross. She was the original one that came up with the 5 stages of grief, but there's an abridged version that really talks about change, because at the end of the day, whenever you're going through change, there is a grief pattern to it. And it's so funny, I've got it pulled up over here because I was coaching someone earlier on it, so it's top of mind. But you go from denial to frustration to depression, And then the curve starts going back up to where it's, the experiment phase where people are going, okay, I'm kind of over my feelings, kind of over the loss. Let me tiptoe into this, see if it's something that I can get behind. And then you get into the decision to commit and then ultimately integration. And, for someone who is addicted to change, I love change. And I'm trying to consult. I find myself really kind of having to take a step back, especially through the kind of the denial and the depression phase, and sitting back and going, okay, we're about to turn the bend. We're about to turn the bend. But I also find that kind of following a 3-step process during that is to communicate, collaborate, and then help the team get to commit. So sometimes you have to bounce between the collaborate and the communicate before ultimately they start making the upward trend toward integration.
Yeah, I think what April and Trent mentioned there are some really important and great ways to approach leading change. I mean, I think one of the things that they're saying is, how you kind of have to figure out which approach fits best the situation and the people, and there's lots of them out there, and those are certainly some of the good ones. I think one of the things that I try to think about is kind of differentiating between, what I as the leader have to do personally, and then what I have to do with the people that I'm leading the change for. So, for example, when I think of myself personally, I think about role modeling, the things that need to be in alignment with the change behaviors, walking the talk, etc. I think about giving honest answers to tough questions. I think about making sure I know what isn't going to change. I think about the way I communicate and make sure that it's behavioral based, and not only just the formal messages that I'm communicating, but the informal ones that I communicate every day through my behaviors and the way I have just side off comments. And I think there's a lot of things as a leader you have to do differently. And then there's the things that you have to do with people, and, coming from the perspective of co-creating change, by involving people, those that it affects specifically and for sure from the beginning, starting small with them, creating experiments that kind of show the potential to change, building support with them and sharing stories and getting stories from them around what's working and what's not working. And ultimately, by engaging with the team, kind of scaling and developing a shared understanding and alignment between us all. So just a different way to look at it in addition to all those models that the other folks also mentioned.
Yeah, and I would say this builds, so just building off of Chris, Trent, and April, right? So here's the thing, there's a little something you can take from every single framework that's out there. You don't need to go out and get a certification. I would say expose yourself to all the different types of frameworks, right? So there is the standard through ACMP, there's ProSci, there's the ProSci AgCar methodology, there's books out there. There's so many different kind of frameworks that you can use, and all of them have a little something that can be helpful. I think it's really identifying what is the type of change and the impact of the change. So in my last organization, I led DEI. How I lead transformation as it relates to DEI is not the exact same as when I was leading change management for Workday implementations, right? I'm going to handle it a little bit differently. I'm going to think about things a little bit differently. So I think that's what's really important, building out what Chris said, figuring out, what do I do as the leader? And then what are we doing as an organization overall? And understanding that while we know that neurologically that change is pain, right? That like it's a different type of pain depending upon the change, and the fears are a little bit different. So tapping into those. But I do encourage everyone to, just get familiar with all the different frameworks that are out there, because there's going to be a little bit of something depending upon the type of change. Just be sure that you are really clear on what that is. There's a ton of cultural transformation frameworks out there. So again, cultural transformation is going to be quite different than, a technology transformation. The core foundation is the same, but the nuances are going to be a bit different.
I love this question. And I think the big aha moment for me in listening to this group is and what I love about the question is it's not about how do you as the leader drive change anymore, right? The world has evolved to using different models as part of our toolkit as leaders and figuring out what to apply in the right context and doing that in a way that communicates the purpose of the change, regardless of what that is. And probably my only addition to this would be is as best as possible, and this is an impossible task, but leading change by trying to take the perspective of those that are going to be impacted and get ahead of that impact, how they might be feeling, to bring them along for the journey, as everyone already so eloquently said.
And I do want to go back to something that Chris said, because it kind of hit me between the eyes, which she has a tendency to do whenever she speaks. So the leadership aspect of it, I think, is something that many of us blow past. You know, we don't take the time to kind of go through that grieving cycle ourselves. You know, I do love change, but there have been times where I was with the International Bank, and we had just gone through this major conversion, this change of organizational structure. And we had just, I think like 3 weeks before, had the celebration of, hey, this is done. Yay, we survived. Excuse me. And then our CHRO pulled all the leaders back in and she says, so Global wants us to now go and do X, Y, and Z. And I'm not known for mincing my words or hiding my face. And I think that she kind of leaned on that, because a lot of times I'd break the ice and go, this is bullshit. You know, why are we doing this? You know, that was just kind of my, like, we just changed, and are we changing for the sake of changing? So I do, Chris, I think that, you know, you brought up a really good point, is kind of looking internally as a leader and saying, okay, what do I need to address so that way I can effectively make sure that I am leading and being that change agent, or that leader of transformation.
So building on that, we are creatures of habit as human beings. We all have our habits of even the simple things of, you know, whether we're writing left-handed or right-handed, or a particular way of sitting. And when those habits have got to change, many times that becomes difficult. And just to build on what Trent and Chris and pretty much all of you said about the self-awareness, looking within yourself, how am I going to be a role model? How am I going to really go through this change and help my team and my organization through it? Many times, change management is about taking a very deficit-based approach. Oh my God, this is not working. How do I fix this? How do I correct it? And it's very much deficit-based. And from there, a lot of experiments, a lot of research has shown that this deficit-based approach doesn't really help take through the change management process in the way desired. What are your views on deficit-based approach, and where have you seen it really fail in the way it's been applied?
Well, I can kick us off. I think probably everyone in this room is familiar with this rule, right? The 80-20 rule, where in change management, right? So the 20% are the people who you're not going to change their mind no matter what, right? So either they're all in no matter what, or they're all against no matter what. And I think that focusing your efforts on that group can be futile. Now, that doesn't mean that you kind of do a broad swath and don't pay attention to them at all, especially if there are key influencers in that group. But I think the need to focus is on the neutral folks, right? The people who kind of could sway either way. It's just like when we approach employee engagement. Any employee engagement tool will tell you focus on the neutral folks. Those are the people that are worth kind of investing that effort in. So I think that's kind of a huge rule of thumb to think about, because we all have negativity bias. It's very easy to just focus on all the people who, you know, oh, they're so against it. Like, how do I change their mind? When really it's about galvanizing the folks who are kind of in the middle, kind of just don't know what's going on. And that's where excellent communication can come in. And I think we often miss the bright spots when we focus on the negativity, right? So looking for the champions, galvanizing the champions. And I think that's where you can have a lot of success. A smaller example would be with a technology transformation. Those champions, they get, usually you do like a little kind of user testing, right? You get the champions in to test it out. They get really excited about it and they share that excitement, right? Instead of, bringing in a bunch of people who decided that they're going to hate the tool no matter what. That's, they're going to find a reason that it's not absolutely perfect. Whereas the champions are going to do a better job of, because they gave it a chance, maybe doing a little bit more kind of communicating on how it can be super helpful and getting people around it. So just some kind of food for thought around when we're thinking about the overall approach to resistance management.
I can just to sort of build on that if possible. Like I agree. It's where it is that we focus, where we spend most of our time with regards to sort of moving people forward is definitely important, and focusing on those who are neutral, who are already positive to the change, can help us get to the other side effectively. And I also think in terms of those people, that 20% or that 10% who seem to be negative, no matter what, do spend a little bit of time trying to mine where that negativity is coming from. And because I've found that the focus, people don't necessarily want to spend, you don't want to spend a lot of time, but you don't want to spend a little time there, because there may be some things or some reasons that they're resisting that might tell us something about the change that we don't know, something that we missed, something that we didn't see about how needs are not being met, or fears that we're not aware of that people are sort of like having, that maybe they're the ones that are showing sort of like an outward behavior that appears to be negative. And sometimes that's the case. There are people who, like you say, no matter what, they're not going to go along with the change. And sometimes there are people in there who know something that we don't know, that we haven't examined, some kind of effects, or there's some kind of unmet need. And so spending some time there trying to figure out what that might be, not a lot of time, as you say, but some time, may help us to figure out something that we could do that might be able to help even move everybody further along, even those that seem like they're already coming with us. So that's, one of the things that I just think that I've learned the hard way, kind of like with some change. And I find out later on that there was some information there that I missed. And some of those people that I didn't necessarily want to interact with a lot, they had it. They had that information. And if I had been able to find a way to get it from them, I may have been able to more effectively move everybody through the change. It's not always the case, but sometimes it is.
And I think it's, in addition to what I just want to bring in one of the audience questions, which I think fits in well here. When somebody is resistant to change, when somebody is negative, and as you mentioned, April, maybe some need is not met, there's some stake is at concern. How does empathy, which is what one of the audience members have asked, how does empathy therefore play a part in helping this change management process?
And it's so funny that question is directed at me, probably one of the most least empathetic people on the panel, because I am very fact-based. It's like, hey, this is what we got to do. But I think leading, there's a very fine line between leading with empathy and sympathy. So empathy is really getting at what's that intrinsic drive of resistance. And sometimes it's Freudian, sometimes it's something that has happened in their past that they're putting in on, this particular change that has nothing to do with the implementation or the project at hand. So you need to kind of take a step back and really just pull them off one-on-one. But I think one of the things, going back to the example where we went through the org change and then went through another one, what got me on board was our CHRO telling the story of getting off the plane, coming back from Spain, and all she could think of is, crap, I'm going to have to get my leaders to go through another change. How am I going to do this? And, she just kind of shared with us the frustration that she had, the angst, the exhaustion that she knew that she was going to be facing. But then she turned around and galvanized us and said, all right, I've gone through that. I want you to go through this over the next however many days you need to, but you call me and you say, I'm 100% in, and then we're going to move forward. And for me, it was like she gave us room to do the grieving, to do the acceptance. And that was so incredibly important for me to kind of take that pause, because it allowed me go through the feelings, but then also leverage that to be more empathetic to those that I was about to issue transformation and change on yet again.
There's another question to April. How can leaders ensure that change initiatives align with the organization's values and long-term goals?
That's a big question. And I think that part of it comes in preparation, the type of support you give the leaders who are going to help move people through the transition and the change. I think that, in a lot of cases when we're sort of putting together our change management supports, one of the places where we try to focus is on leaders and leadership readiness and their readiness to help people through change. And I think that in those conversations or in those workshops or in those coaching sessions, tying people back to organizational values, how are those meant to show up in all the work we do, including the way that we interact with our peers and others around change, I think goes a long way around that sort of coaching and support and sort of like driving it back to there. And then with regards to long-term impact of the organization, hopefully, and I say hopefully because I don't know that it actually happens as much as we want it to, if we are able to sort of partner at the beginning of the case when people are thinking through kind of like the change portfolio, what type of changes we know that we want to try to implement versus those that I know that kind of like come up, helping people be able to think through and prioritize, connect one change to another, how do we sequence, what's our long-term result, how do we nest, different things, what are we really going to try to accomplish this year for the longer term goals or strategy versus next year. I mean, that's easier said than done, right? Prioritization is like a big problem or a big issue, but if you can get people around that prioritization, I think I found that be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately this whole idea of deficit-based change management is just something that all of us probably have to try to not get sucked into, I guess, is one way I might say it. I mean, usually when companies embark on a change, it's to solve a problem. But people tend to forget that when you solve one problem, that often you create new problems. And, when you're solving a problem, it really, I think, makes sense to think about what is actually working and not getting sucked into the specific problem that you're trying to solve, but the bigger picture systems thinking aspect, like what processes are working, what rewards and recognitions and reinforcements are working, and what policies are working. And fundamentally, what are some of the core assumptions that are underlying the thing that you're trying to fix? Because often the assumptions might still be the same. It's just that how we address them is different. And sometimes those assumptions aren't accurate anymore. But, taking time to find out what's working well instead of just focusing on the problem aspect, I think is one way to kind of enhance or make your change more successful. Because ultimately, if you want to get positive psychology, into this whole thing, how about instead of solving problems, we figure out what is working really well and how we can make it better. That would be a complete flip of this whole thing.
And I love that, Chris. Sorry. What you have just mentioned is about the appreciative inquiry approach, which is not just forgetting all the negatives, but really looking at what's working well. What can I amplify in the current situation? And given the dynamics of the market, the environment, and where we need to be, what can I add on? And just on the audience question of empathy, I think that's a perfectly empathy-based approach, where you're looking at and building on what is already working well, rather than just, I've been in organizations where, a new boss comes in and everything is changed, including the seating, without actually thinking about, do we really need this change? And I really think appreciative inquiry approach brings in the empathy element. Sorry, Alex, I think I cut you off. Please. Oh, no, sorry, Nikki.
No worries. No worries. I was going to piggyback on Chris's comment around, I think the way you implement change that isn't deficit based is by building, it's like finishing the story, right? The story of the deficit is like what's not working. But actually, if we can create the picture and the vision around what the solution will be and what our reality will be in the new solution, we can get past the problems we're trying to fix and move to the next horizon of that change, which is what is the new normal or the new reality. And probably where we've seen that done terribly and really well in recent organizations is really around this whole new world of work and future, hybrid, flexible. The organizations that focus too narrowly on the problems and didn't think in the long term about how we want this to work, I think we're those who focused on the deficit approach.
And I can't remember if it was you, Nikki, or Alex, that we kind of geeked out on the Heath Brothers book Switch. I can't
That was
remember
us.
which one. Yeah, that for anyone that is looking about change and focusing on the bright spots, it's already been mentioned, Clearing the Path. It is a fantastic book that gets into the psychology of change. And I think I read it in 2010. I could still probably quote chapters from it. So just a little recommendation since we're on topic.
Yeah, I guess this is what I do. I want to pull a few things together of like what we've been talking about. So going back to April's question, she touched on this, but just to make it really clear, a change should only be made if it aligns with the values, right? So we're talking like, how do you make sure the change initiatives line up with the values? Well, the change shouldn't even be taking place if you didn't already design it in a way to live out your values. Now, if you're trying to change your values, obviously that's a different story, but whatever you're trying to evolve to, that's what it should be working towards, right? So I think that's a really key part of this whole thing. Let me give you a small, very clear example. So many of you may have or may not have heard about all of the bias that can be related to when people use the term culture fit to hire people. Right? Culture fit is often an ambiguous term that is used to hire people you want to have a drink with or you want to hang out with versus someone who is a culture add to the organization. It's often used to hire people who are similar to the people who are already there. And so what we did in a previous organization was we got to the root of, well, what are we trying to get at here with culture fit? And interestingly enough, not a lot of people could answer that very well. But what we realized was it was about core values alignment. So we eliminated culture fit from any of our questions, anything regarding recruiting, and we changed it entirely to core values alignment. And that helped filter into all of our other processes. So is that step for everything we do to say, does this align with our core values? And that's just a small example that I think can help kind of trickle down or through to the other things. The other thing I want to mention about is empathy. So empathy is very much, buzzword. It is important. I get it. My dissertation research, part of it involves looking at perspective taking versus empathy and what can be the most impactful. I think empathy is actually more difficult, kind of the higher you go in the organization. If you've ever read Neural Leadership Institute, they talk about how power makes you stupid, right? So you have the most amount of self-awareness at middle management level because you're getting feedback both from above you and below you. And then when you get higher, it's very easy to lose that sense of empathy. So it is something that, it's a skill that can come and go. So I really encourage when I'm coaching leaders to take perspective. Now, it can often end up with, being more on the empathetic side of things. But I think when you give them that, like I can't expect them to, just to give a very clear example, for an older white male who always grew up upper class to necessarily empathize with someone from a very different, area, very different position in life. But what they can do is take their perspective. I can translate it to maybe an experience they've had where they felt left out or they felt like, people were changing things without their input. Just anything I can do to kind of relate it, and then they can take the perspective. So it's another thing just to keep in mind, because I think, a lot of leaders get scared of that word empathy. Trent joked like I'm the least empathetic person, right? it can be a very difficult thing to define and to help people really feel like they can do well. But if you can get them to take perspective, you can relate it to something that, you know, really is something that moves them. I think that's where you can move the needle. So just want to kind of touch on those couple items.
Thank you, Alex. And I think at this point in time, this question is quite relevant. And this question is to Nikki from the audience. What are the potential risks and consequences of ineffective change leadership? I think they've touched upon a little bit, but maybe if we could focus on answering this question. Over to you, Nikki. Thank you.
Sure, happy to start off on that one. I think, not to be dramatic, but the potential risks and consequences are that you lose the kind of trust of the organization if you are ineffective in leading through change. And that can be through one big blunder, many small, but the real risk or consequence is you need to either rebuild that trust, which we all know is extremely difficult, or the organization isn't with you anymore, and you are, instead of all moving down the same path together, you start to see divergence, undermining, toxic culture. It isn't pretty. So it really, to me, all leadership, all management, I think we spoke about this the last time we were all together, it's all change management. The world moves too quickly now. We don't stop and wait and do change in Q4. You always have to be thinking as a leader about how am I managing small change, big change, and building trust and confidence.
And I think one of the malpractices for many of us in HR is that we think of that as a one-time-a-year course in leadership, change management. That should be something that we're hitting on once a month. You know, I mean, to Nikki's point, this is kind of par for the course now of being a leader.
Thanks for the golf pun there, Trent.
You're well. That's the only. Oh, is that actually a golf thing? I am not a sports person, so you know, I think Alex, you were talking about people relating or whatever. All of my leadership team uses sports analogies, and I just sit there like with the blank stares, like I need subtitles. You know, tell me what that says. But I do think that as HR practitioners, we need to make it our mission to make sure that we're keeping this top of mind, and not just when we're about to go into a major overhaul. That's the worst time to try and train people on change management. It should be kind of like breadcrumbs, just continuous improvement, continuous learning.
Now, change creates uncertainty. And from a neuroscience perspective, there's been enough research and analysis done on this that when we meet with uncertainty, the brain perceives it as a threat. And, you know, to your point, Nikki, yeah, there is change all the time. And we have to therefore also, as individuals, as leaders, as part of a team, know how to manage our brain in order to deal with this change. So what are some of the most important behaviors? Now, Alex did mention perspective taking. We have mentioned empathy. What are some of the other most important behaviors that people who lead change need to role model or need to have?
I think of at the basics, you all may have some other things that are more complex than this, but I think about the ability to actually connect with people and meet them where they are. I think sort of like that ability to be able to have, you know, that exchange, to make that connection on whatever level you can make it, right? So depending on who we're talking about or what the change is or what your role is, it might be different. But I always think about some kind of connection making first, because to me, that's the way that you're going to be able to have the dialogue, continue the dialogue, or help sort of like people move along or move through, or really maybe understand things that you don't necessarily already understand about what it is that everybody's trying to undertake together. And I know there's a variety of different ways to do that. And sometimes you may already have connection with some people and not with other people, but starting out with a basic dialogue. And a lot about connection is is perspective building, or taking perspective can start that kind of like connection, you know, as Alex was talking about, when you don't know someone and you don't know the parties and you're coming in there from the very beginning, that could start to generate that opening up. But I do think that connection, so you can find out where people are, so you can meet them there, and hopefully think of ways to be able to walk through together. That's what comes to mind for me.
Yeah, and I think we've touched on several different angles on like emotional related things, like empathy and perspective and things like that. I think one aspect that we haven't hit yet is maybe just more tactical, but you know, a version of being able to put yourselves in the shoes of your employees as you lead them is being able to communicate like what it actually means to them on a day-to-day basis. So, you know, if you're presenting the concept of some kind of large change, can you translate that into how are we going to do that? If you're trying to talk about long-term goals, can you make it sound like, where do we begin, people? Us, where do we begin? If you're talking about generally around the objectives of a large-scale change, can you articulate, here's our priorities? And so I could keep going on that, but you know, it's the ability as a leader to take that, put yourself in their shoes perspective, but and apply it in a bunch of different ways that ultimately shows up in the day-to-day activities that you as a leader do.
I think it's probably, this question is for Alex from one of the audience members. How can leaders inspire and motivate their teams during times of change? What are some common challenges the leaders face when driving organizational change? And I think this fits in appropriately to the behaviors of leaders that we're discussing right now. Alex?
Was that yeah, I was going to say that. Is Alex frozen?
I think she is frozen. I think so. Maybe one of you can, though the question is for Alex, I guess till she comes back on, one of you could sort of build on what we've been talking till now on behaviors.
She's back. She's back.
Ah,
I'm back.
welcome
Sorry,
back, Alex.
everyone.
Thank God, because I didn't
Thank
answer the
you.
question.
Of course, it was what the question was to me, right? Of course. Okay, so you talked about some behaviors, right? So it's interesting. It actually brings me back to, there was a question around large organizations that have done this well previously in the chat. And one that actually comes to mind, I wasn't involved in this change, but I researched about it. So Microsoft, when the CEO came in, he was very adamant about changing it from a know-it-all to a learn-it-all culture. And I think embedding that was a huge reason why his leaders have felt more capable leading change. And what gives me, you know, kind of validation that it's happened is that there's someone in my class that works for Microsoft, and she didn't even know that like there was this whole like case study thing, all of that. She just talked about how growth mindset is so intricately involved in everything they do. And she was just talking about how much learning is absolutely a part of the job. So that was one that I wanted to make sure I answered. And with that, right, I think cultivating a growth mindset is actually a huge part of being able to lead change, being flexible, being adaptable. I think to April's point, you know, being able to connect is really important. That's where we get into perspective taking. And I think it is just building habits. So one of the things I did when I started leading DEI was I did a series of micro learnings, right? Just to build habits. What are like a few things you can do in a meeting to make sure that the meeting is inclusive? What are a few things, you know, you can do, you know, presentation, a few ways that you can really galvanize people. So I think that, you know, all of that combined are some ways that leaders can really feel comfortable taking on the challenge. Hopefully I did not freeze or cut out at all. Did everyone get that? Okay, okay, good.
Yes. There's another question which I think, again, fits in very well to what we have said about connection, perspective taking. The question is, are there, and this is not addressed to anyone specifically, so any of you can answer, are there specific communication techniques or tools that are particularly effective for conveying the need for change and its benefit to employees?
I'll jump in here first and start by saying I can tell you it's likely not email. And I can also tell you that, one of the misnomers around specific communication techniques or channels, et cetera, is that it's about those. And I would argue it's about the timing. I would argue that it's about the timing of the communication. It's about the honesty of the communication. It's about the ability that you have to actually anticipate and relate to how people are going to take this message. And there's ultimately many types of tools and techniques. I know we've used Teams in different ways. We've used Yammer and all sorts of other things like that. But I really think those aren't as important as the things I mentioned earlier around timing and content, et cetera.
I totally agree with that, and would attach to that around the timing, the frequency, and then also being able to continue to communicate on a smaller level, on a larger level when you're still figuring things out. So there's no vacuum. There's no time. There's a time where people are bringing their own stories like we all do to whatever it is that's transpiring, because they're not hearing anything else, and so when working with leaders, I'm like, listen, you may not have any new news for your team. That there is no news when we're going through a change is news. That is news. Let them know that you're still working that through, still looking for ideas for this. There's no word on that, so that people don't come up with their own stories in between and somehow you'll need to counteract later on, or at least there's a lower frequency of that you have to counteract later on. That's just what I would add to your points, Chris.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point, April. And one of the most terrifying things as leaders is the reality that the way we now communicate is unfiltered. It's using some of those two-way interactive, whether it's employee chat groups that are public. You get great information. It can feel scary for those in leadership roles, but actually creating, I think it was Chris who said it's about the moments of communication and making that the core is being available, whether it be in person, whether it be virtually, but creating spaces for conversation, to know what's on people's minds, to raise questions that you might not otherwise get in a series of very beautifully curated town halls. So really being open to the messiness of the change and engaging in that.
Also, I think important is, to build on whatever all of you have said, Chris, April, Nikki, is the listening. Because many times communication through various modes happen. You have more and more tools and techniques, but there's no one to listen in to what sense making can I do? What is not being said? What is the feeling I'm getting out of this situation? And really having a transparent, open discussion where people can also feel it's okay to be vulnerable and it's okay to express what I really want to express, and that will get addressed. Which leads me to another question from one of the audience. Can you provide guidance on developing training programs or resources to help leaders and employees enhance their empathy and sympathy skills for more effective change management? Now, this is what I do as well. And I would say appreciative inquiry is definitely one of the foundations to start with. And I'll leave it to all of you to sort of expand on that or build on that and add your perspectives.
Yeah. It's interesting. The first thing that comes to mind is training is not the solution. I do think it can supplement, right? But I think it's about how your organization is set up and how you facilitate connection making, right? I think that empathy more naturally, or perspective taking more naturally, comes when you've got that connection. Exactly what April said earlier, right? But how is that encouraged in your organization? Is your organization very hierarchical and the leadership is inaccessible? Well, sure, you can teach them empathy, but if they're not ever kind of getting any idea of what the front line is going through, that's where things like, job shadowing, doing some sort of rotational programs, just to like really understand what people are going through. I remember when I was in HR, I sat next to, if you all have ever heard of eDiscovery, basically the people who are in eDiscovery, they're staring at this huge screen, going through file after file after file after file, looking for evidence. Okay. It is a very, my hat's off to anyone who does this line of work. And it was so important for me, just as an HR person. I sat next to someone that entire day just to see what it was like in their job. And that gave me a whole lot of empathy. When I started with my last company, I started in the delivery department and then moved to internal. And that gave me this incredible perspective on HR that I didn't have when I was in HR. So I think getting out of the office and getting into facilitating, job rotation, job shadowing, facilitating conversations. We used to have at a previous organization, as part of onboarding, breakfast with the CEO, right? And that could be virtual, but really having that accessibility to leadership and facilitating that leads to that connection building, that leads to that empathy. And then any training should actually just be a supplement.
Yeah, I think that's a very diverse sort of set of tools that you've outlined. You're absolutely right. Training is not necessarily, the answer, and some of those experiential things that you talked about really help people get a closer view into what really is happening. And just a concept, if we were going to do any kind of, training to supplement, for me, it comes down to emotional intelligence, I guess, is what pops to my mind. So like being able to take your own perspective and your own view, part of EQ is understanding your own emotions and how they drive you, before you can necessarily be able to connect into how other people's emotions might be driving them, and then sort of like ways in which to sort of like meet others after you've understood the best way to meet yourself. So all of that EQI, stuff and those models, and however it is that you break it down in such a way that it makes sense for your particular leaders, your particular organization, maybe even a particular change, right? All of that's going to be the lens in which you introduce that concept is going to be most helpful, or sort of like super drive any of the other experiential things that you may be doing. But I think of EQ when I think of that.
There's another question which is, I think, very relevant, especially in some of the industries which are highly regulated. The question is as follows. How do you keep communication a priority when legal constantly blocks information being put out in writing?
I think one of the first ways to engage with legal or compliance, or some of those areas that have some real valid concerns about what gets put in writing, is trying to start early with them about what can be put in writing. And often there's more that can be put in writing than you realize. And you have to work at that, I think, a little early to get them to open up to that option. I think that the other thing to consider when it comes to communication is what else could you say about the thing beyond what you're currently saying. And it could be that, instead of sharing some specific thing that relates to a legal concept, you instead could share some research or news, or something that's learning related around what's driving the change. I think there's just a little bit more creativity that unfortunately you have to put in play there when you're dealing with what are very valid written communication concerns.
Yeah, maybe a small addition. I think, Chris, you handled, that's a tough question. Sometimes a constraint is just a constraint. And that's the reality of some industries, as Lolita highlighted. The only additional suggestion would be sometimes a conversation around, even if we say this on a town hall, or if we're allowed to say it orally, verbally, in this day and age, our communication, once public, it is as good as in writing. We don't know, what if we're recording meetings, or what people are quoting or stating or saying. So sometimes shifting the conversation around in writing to what is confidential or not confidential may help unlock some of those barriers.
And most of us probably have experienced this, that when there's a change management, or when there is change, re-engineering, restructuring, and similar kinds of merger and arbitrage, mergers and acquisitions, most are quick to sell the benefits of change. And rarely do people involved in the change management have a conversation that involves discussing the pain, discussing the real downside, the concerns that people may have. In short, leaders who are put in charge of change management probably shy away from being vulnerable. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'll go first, and I know everyone will add to what I say. I mean, I think pain, first of all, is something that we don't have to create as much of, let's say. And I think that when change creates a lot of pain, there's some explanation for it. Like pain can result from leaving people out of the solutions, or pain can come from not understanding the why. And ultimately, the more proactive you can be around your change, the more you can clue people into what's going on at a macro level and how it might be important to go in this new direction, and how they can contribute to it, and help them be a part of crafting the solution rather than just reacting to what someone else might have designed. I think the less pain you create. So I do think there's an aspect there of the more in front and the more to the left you can get, the less pain you can create. But that all said, there's sometimes you can't keep pain from happening. And so just like you alluded to, talking about the benefits of change, of course, but it's also important to admit that there will be losses associated with it, change. And ideally, you'd identify those losses from an employee point of view, and you would discuss them, and you would find as much as you can from the losses, what was good, perhaps with a part of something that's being lost that you could take forward. And then lastly, I've definitely done the thing where you bring up what's being lost and you celebrate it and you honor it, and you make it a transition so that people can move through it rather than getting stuck there. So those are some of the ideas I have.
And Chris, some of those ideas tie right into Bridget's letting go phase, which, I'm always sort of like so excited, to hear about. So, being realistic can be difficult to be sort of like vulnerable with your team. The more realistic you can be in the beginning, so that people understand that we're living in the same reality that they're living in, right? If they feel like you're living in another reality, their ability to be able to help people, shepherd them through the change, I think that's going to have to be very difficult. People, I find, or at least I find I need from my leaders, a really understanding of like, yes, this is happening. Yes, these are some of the things you might, yes, I see it too, as opposed to just trying to like not seeing, and people are disconnected from you throughout the change, sort of like when that happens. So I think, as you're saying, sort of really sort of like addressing it, getting in there, making sure everybody knows that we're both all living through the same reality is going to be very, helpful. It's a lot easier to help manage people or help people do transition in that way, even though it might feel a little bit uncomfortable in the beginning, than it is later on when you're like, that person's living in a whole other world. I don't know how we're supposed to connect to that.
I'd jump in and saying I think just building on what's already been said, we all know, our leaders know, our organizations, our staff, our employees, we all know what the pain points are and the risks are. We might even prep them and share them with our boards. So we know we're talking about them and thinking about them. And I think the risk reward of not addressing it in an open way, engaging with staff and owning those pain points, honoring what's lost, as Chris and April are saying, it just does a disservice to the credibility of the whole change to pretend like, oh, it's sunny skies ahead. So acknowledging that, engaging others, sometimes they'll help actually mitigate some of those pain points in ways that maybe leadership hadn't thought about. But maybe framing it, I think, is the takeaway for myself, is remembering to frame it in that factual way and not have to present a perfect scenario on the other side will create more credibility, more authenticity, and ultimately, I think, better buy-in for the change in the long run.
And I think it's really about having those behaviors all year long, no matter whether you're going through a huge transformation or not. That's how you build the credibility, building connection, being transparent. Take every day as an opportunity to build credibility through transparency. Obviously, we talked earlier about regulatory concerns, make sure you're doing it within the parameters that's allowed. But if you do that all year round, you don't have to worry about it during a change, because you've already built up that credibility with people, that they know that you're going to be transparent, and there's less likelihood they're going to make up a lot of stories in their head. So, just something to think about that year round, when you talk about training programs, right? Like, maybe it's also about communication, setting expectations, all of those things can help build those skills.
We have 3 minutes left. And just to sort of summarize, it's about connectivity, making the connections, being transparent, finding the right balance between pain and reward, having conversations regularly. Closing remarks from each of you, probably in one sentence. Whoever wants to go first can go.
Maybe I can start, and I'll quote someone south of the border for me, but I think it was the infamous RBG who said, lead in a way others want to follow. And I think that's just, it's such a compelling quote about the way you lead and the way you lead through change.
I'll quote Bridges and say it's not the change, it's the transition. And so all of these things that we've talked about, emotionally connectedness, thinking about people go through change, I think zeroing in on those things and caring for those things are really going to help people get most successfully to the future state.
Yeah, I'll just add, make time for it. Make time for it. It's not something that happens by accident. You don't do it your best when you're reacting. You literally need to schedule a little bit of time on your calendar, maybe weekly, daily, I don't know, to sit and think about what you're going to purposely do to lead the change.
And I think just with how the world is now, especially, think of all leadership as change leadership, right? There's always going to be new changes. All the great behaviors you build up over time, those are going to be applicable to a change. So don't think of it in terms of a separate thing, but just that is what leadership is.
Thank you so much to our audience who've been very engaging, and thank you to all of you. And hopefully we'll get on another panel on the same topic another time. Goodbye. See you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.